And then there were Upanishads and whatnot, Indian literature. There was so much of it, we probably couldn't spend our time reading those because we had homeworks to finish, exams to write. And these days we see some of that wisdom that's been in those books is coming back to us as management principles and management books. And today we have the opportunity to listen to Ram Nidumolu, who has put such an effort where he is taking the wisdom out of Upanishads and extracting it and has written a book called Two Birds in a Tree, Timeless Indian Wisdom for Business. Let me give a quick introduction to Mr. Ram. He is the founder and CEO of a company called Innovastrat, which is a business management strategy for earlier. He was a CEO of a software consulting company. Ram's thought leadership has appeared in cover stories of Harvard Business Review, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and many other business journals. A little bit about the book which he is going to release today is it's called Two Birds in a Tree, Timeless Indian Wisdom for Business. Ram Nidumolu uses evocative parables and stories from the ancient Indian wisdom texts, the Upanishads, to introduce being-centered leadership using the experiences of over 20 trailblazing CEOs. So let me invite Mr. Ram Nidumolu to talk about his book.
Thank you. Actually, this is the book. Two Birds in a Tree. And I don't know if you know the symbolism of the two birds, the meaning. So this is actually from the Rig Veda. And about 1200 BC, as you know, is the Rig Veda. Then after that, two of the Upanishads talk of the two birds. One is the Mundaka Upanishad, and the other is the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. And in the Mundaka Upanishad, the story is told of there are two birds in a tree, and the lo dva suparna saija sakhaya samanam vruksham parishasva jataya tayor anya pipalam swadyatya nashnam anyo abhi. Oh, okay. Let me say that again. Maybe I'll come in the middle. So, in the Mundaka Upanishad, can you hear that? In the Mundaka Upanishad, so there's a verse that says, Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakhaya Samanam Vruksham Parishasva Jate Tayor Anyaha Pipalam Swadyatya Anashnam Anyo Abhichapishi. And what that means is there are two birds in the very same tree. And one of the birds, which is the lower bird, tries to eat fruit, tries to find fruit here and there, and constantly in anxiety and sorrow is trying to look for more fruit. The other bird, which is up in the tree, is looking on with compassionate silence. It's looking at this lower bird with compassion and with silence. And then the Mundaka Upanishad goes on. When the lower bird looks at the higher bird, catches a glimpse of the higher bird, it loses all its fear and sorrow. So that's the story. Can you hear me if I speak loud like this? Is it okay? It's okay, that's fine, okay. So the reason why I wrote this book actually is very similar to Carl's entrepreneurship thing. So in a way, this book is about the internal world of the entrepreneur. And while a lot of the work is in terms of the external, how to do a value proposition, so on, this is about the internal world of the entrepreneur. And my own background, just very quickly, the usual, I sort of did my engineering and MBA in India, and then did a PhD. I did a PhD in management at UCLA and was a professor for almost 10 years. And then I thought to myself, I'm just doing teaching. I'm not doing actual implementation. And by then I had fallen in love with the Upanishads, and especially the Isha Upanishad. How many of you know the Isha Upanishad? So that's, you know these words, okay. So when I was trying to finish my PhD, I sort of discovered the Upanishads, and then I found that they had a big influence on me. They had a big effect on me. I ended up finishing my PhD, my dissertation in 3 months instead of 1 or 2 years. And then when I became a professor, I ended up reading a lot more of the Upanishads, reading some of the Sanskrit. And I realized that in the Isha Upanishad there is a verse which talks of knowledge and action. That those who follow both knowledge and action, through knowledge overcome death, and through action attain immortality. And I kept thinking of that. You know, my life was all about knowledge. I was talking about business, writing about business, and publishing and research and so on. But I was not acting on business. So when I was 40 years old, I said, you know, forget it, and decided to start up. So I see many here who are sort of middle-aged, 40s, 50s maybe. Now I have a quick question. How many of you are thinking of doing a startup now in your middle age? How many are planning that? Hopefully I'm not insulting you by saying you're middle-aged. But I do see many.
That's why I didn't answer the question.
I see. How many of you young people think you're starting a company now? Okay. And how many of you are in companies where you're thinking, you know, I've spent 10, 20 years in my company, what's the use of all this? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? What do I do next? And how many of you are not thinking at all? But so this book is the result of those questions I asked myself when I was 40, when I started a company. And that company failed. It was a tremendous failure, I would say. I raised $7 million in VC funding. Unfortunately, it didn't do well. And you know, my inexperience, immaturity, and so on. And then I started another company, which did relatively well. And now, just a few days ago, I'm into a third company now, the chief operating officer of another company in San Francisco. So in the past, now 15 years of entrepreneurship, and also working with, in the second company, I worked with many Fortune 500 companies. And sort of the goal then was to make them more sustainable. How do you get them to think in terms of not just money, but also think of the environment, and also think about how to treat their people better, how to treat society better, and so on. Sustainability. So that's what the second company is. And that's where I found the three come together. Entrepreneurship, sustainable business, and the Upanishads. And for me, that's the lesson I learned, that even when you fail in a startup, so the question is, and that's the question I ask in this book, let's say you start a company, and you don't do what Carl's saying. Let's say you don't do it. And I didn't do what you said. And let's say it doesn't work. You know, you fail. And you lose a lot of money, you lose friends, family maybe. What do you do? What do you do? Here you are, let's say, some of you, 50 years old. You had all these aspirations and ambitions and goals and hopes and so on. And then you lose everything. Where do you go? And let's say you're in a company and you spend 20, 30 years in your company and you get fired. What do you do? Where do you go? And that's something that will happen to perhaps 90% of us. So 9 out of 10 will face that at least once, perhaps many times in our life. So this book is really about that situation when you come down to, you know, you had all those dreams, great business case. If that doesn't happen, where do you go? And I think that's where we Indians have something very precious and unique. We can go somewhere, and that to me is the Vedanta, is the Upanishads. And that's where I went. And so this book is about my journey there, what I learned through the Upanishads. And what I realized was far more important than the money you can make through startups, the material success you can get through startups, the fame and glory you can get through startups, the presentations in Thai and other conferences you can do through successful startups. I learned there's something much more than that. And that's essentially what the book is about. Whether you're in a company where your job is not going well, or the company is not doing well, or your company is not sustainable, what can you do to still be a leader? Regardless of your material situation, regardless of your startup, regardless of your job, regardless of the struggles you have in your life, what can you still do to be a leader. And that's really what this book is. And I call that journey, when your material success really at some level doesn't matter to you or fades or is not within reach, that journey of still being a leader and still getting meaning out of your life. And that meaning matters when you're in your 40s and 50s. Then you realize you have 10, 20 years more to live. What have you done with your life? So it's at that stage that I think a new journey begins. It's a journey beyond startups and technology in Silicon Valley. It's a journey beyond all your aspirations when you were young. It's a new journey, and it's the real journey. That's the journey that the Upanishads talk about. That's the journey of being-centered leadership. And that's what I call this whole leadership approach, being-centered leadership. And because we are Indians here, and in the book I say being, but really it's, in the Upanishads, being is Brahman, as all of you know. But Brahman is also Atman. Brahman is that which is the universal object. But how do you reach that? How do you even understand that universal object that seems to be out there? And that's the higher bird in the tree, by the way. So the answer to that is really to look inside yourself for that universal subject. And that universal subject is the Atman. And to me, that journey of trying to discover, it's a long journey. It might take many lifetimes, may never be successful. But what you learn on that journey is it doesn't matter if you're successful. There is no such notion as success. Going on that journey gives you an awareness and a wealth that exceeds all that startups can do, successful startups can do. Because I know many successful entrepreneurs who are still not satisfied. They do well in one, and the great story is Jim Clark, the Silicon Graphics founder. When he was asked, before he started Silicon Graphics, what would make you happy? He said, $1 million will make me happy. After Silicon Graphics, someone asked, what will make you happy? He said, $100 million will make me happy. Then he did Netscape, as you know, Mark Andreessen. After Netscape succeeded, he was asked, what will make you happy? He said, $1 billion will make me happy. And so on it went. And at the end, it turned out that nothing would make him happy. Because, the sense of, I need to do even better than Steve Jobs. There is no limit to it. There's no end to what will make you happy on that route. And so that's the message I think I've taken from my own life, that, there is another path. And for that, let me tell you the story, which many of you know, of Nachiketa and Yama. How many of you know that story? There's quite a few. Okay. So I'll tell you two stories. So the first story is about this other path, which I know from experience will give you joy in your life, more than what a startup, a materially successful startup will do. So this is the story of Nachiketa. Once, and this is the Kathopanishad, once long ago, Ushan, the son of the sage Vajrashravasa, offered a sacrifice. And this is a great sacrifice. But what he was sacrificing were useless things. He was sacrificing cows that had no milk. He was sacrificing land that had no value. And his son, Nachiketa, a young boy, and that's the story typically in the Upanishads, a young boy filled with wisdom. So Nachiketa looks at his father and all he's sacrificing and says, what he's sacrificing are useless things. With this kind of a sacrifice, my father will surely go to the lands of the dead. And then he speaks up and says, Father, will you sacrifice me? Because I am of value to you. Then it's a real sacrifice. Then Ushan ignores him the first time. Nachiketa again asks a second time. He's ignored again a second time. Then finally the father gets angry and says, I will sacrifice you to death, to Yama. And once that threat or that oath has been uttered, it can't be taken back. And then Nachiketa goes to the land of the dead. But unfortunately Yama is away. He's away on business. Perhaps visiting down here. But he's away on business. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Nachiketa has to be alone in Yama's house. And when Yama comes back, a voice calls out to Yama and says, beware of the bad deeds you have done. You have mistreated a sacred guest. You will have to do something in return. For 3 nights you ignored him. You have to do something in return. Yama gets scared and terrified, comes back and tells Nachiketa, I'll give you 3 boons for not being there when you were here, not treating you like a holy guest. I'll give you 3 boons. Pick which boons these are. First boon, I guess you're thinking now, may the first boon let me get my dinner. But the first boon, Nachiketa says, is let me return to the land of the living and let my father be happy when he sees me. And Yama says, it's yours, not a problem. Then Yama says, what's your second boon? Then Nachiketa says, you Yama, you know the fire, the sacred fire, Agni, that links us ordinary mortals to the mortals in the heavens. Tell me that fire, and what is that fireplace, and how to build that fireplace. And Yama says, here's how you do it. It is instructions, the Kathopanishad, on how to do it. And then Yama turns to Nachiketa and says, can you recite these instructions? Have you learned well? Nachiketa recites it perfectly. And then Yama says, I will give you another boon. I will name this fire after Nachiketa. This fire of Nachiketa, which is what we call now. Then Yama says, what's your third boon? And this is how the Upanishad stories are set up. There's a lot of story, then the real message. And now begins the real message of the Kathopanishad, which deals very aptly, with great relevance to what I said earlier. Nachiketa says, tell me, Lord of Death, Yama, you who know everything, you before whom mortals tremble, what happens to us after we die? What happens to ordinary human beings after we die? Then Yama says, this is the question I cannot answer. Even the gods of old, even the great gods of old asked this question. Even they did not know the answer. I cannot answer this question. Instead, let me give you cattle, let me give you wealth, let me give you land. Ask another question. Nachiketa says, no, that is my question. What use is cattle when we grow old? What use is good health when we are about to die? What use is wealth when we're about to die? What use is all this when we're reaching in our 50s and 60s and so on? And I'm wondering what we should do. Tell me what happens to us after we die. Then Yama says, that is a question I cannot answer. I'll give you maidens, I'll give you musical instruments, I'll give you chariots, I'll give you all the pleasures in the world. Take all that. Even be the king, lordship of the entire world. But I can't answer that question. Nachiketa says, no, that is, what use is all that? When you, death, is over my shoulder, what use is all this wealth? Then Yama says, you have passed my test. Let me now tell you what happens. I've given you all these temptations and you turn them down. Then Yama begins the instruction. And the instruction is, there are two paths before the soul of man. The two paths that we all face in this life and as we approach death. There is the path of pleasure, and there is the path of joy. The path of joy is the Shreyas, the higher joy. The path of pleasure is prayers. And mortals always, at all times, face these two paths. And most of us take the path of pleasure. And when they take the path of pleasure, Yama says, they fall into my clutches over and over again. They die over and over again. They come to me over and over again. The one who takes the path of joy escapes my clutches and lives forever. The one who chooses this harder path, which is referred to as the edge of a razor, Shurasya Dhara, the edge of a razor. The one who chooses that difficult path, which initially is like poison and then becomes like Amritam. Initially it is difficult, hard, it just seems, why are you doing this? When everyone else is pursuing successful startups or successful business, why are you doing this? The one who chooses that second path will initially find great difficulties, but slowly, as the days go by, a whole different Amritam comes up. And that's the lesson that Yama says. The one who chooses the path of joy, who looks beyond what the startup is for, what the business is for, and tries to find a higher meaning to it. Tries to find a meaning beyond oneself, to perhaps serving others, perhaps serving the environment, serving humanity, or even serving the Atman. The one who finds a higher meaning, finds something that is far, far more significant, that stays with you when you have failed in whatever you try to do, whether it's in business, whether it's in startups. So that's really the message of joy versus. And by the way, that movie Razor's Edge, which some of you may have seen, the book Somerset Maugham, was based on the Kathopanishad. So that's the story of how the Upanishads do matter to us. And in this book I talk about a dozen stories, about 20 CEOs, many large companies I've consulted with, who amazingly, unbelievably, chose this path of joy as opposed to the path of pleasure. And in my mind, because I now work entirely in sustainability, I think that's the solution to what we are facing now, both internally and in terms of society and the environment. We need to choose the path that Yama was pointing out to us, the path of joy, not the path of pleasure. The path of pleasure is wonderful, but what is initially like sugar becomes like poison. The path of joy, initially like poison, becomes like sugar. Especially as we approach the later stages of our life, I can assure you that that's a path that you will find endless joy. Atyantam sukhamashnate. That's the path that you will find great joy. Thank you.